harmony for disaster mitigation. My life is my message, said Gandhi ji. Gandhi's principle is still found to be relevant and important for disaster risk reduction in times to come. No one be left behind, and last mile connectivity for reducing risk is possible only when the disaster management approach is bottom up and driven by the communities. By any means, nature has to be protected and a symbiotic balance to be maintained between nature, science, and people with fearless, ethic-based, and in a disciplined manner. Mahatma Gandhi's motto of self-reliance and indigenous knowledge is integral to innovativeness in disaster management and mitigation practices. NDRG is committed to Gandhian principles of sustainability and self-reliance, and to mark his birth anniversary, we have organized this lecture on peace and harmony with disaster mitigation in collaboration with the leading law school of India, NUJS Kolkata. On behalf of NDRG, I welcome you all. So to start with, I'll just briefly introduce the chair, and I'll then hand the session over to Dr. Amita. So our chair for today is Dr. Nirmal Kanti Chakrabarti. After graduating from the University of Calcutta, Dr. Chakrabarti did his LLB, MA and LLM from the University of Calcutta and got his PhD from the University of Burdwan on probation system in the administration of criminal justice in West Bengal. Immediately after passing LLM in 1985, Dr. Chakrabarti joined in West Bengal Education Service and was posted as lecturer in Government of West Bengal, Hooghly Mohsin College. On 27th November 1996, he joined the University of Calcutta and retired as professor in the Department of Law. He worked as director of School of Law, KIIT Bhubaneswar, and from 2009 to 2019, Professor Chakrabarti joined as Vice Chancellor in the West Bengal National University of Juridical Sciences. As a prolific writer, Dr. Chakrabarti has so far authored 7 books. He has also published more than 100 articles and research papers in various national and international journals. He has established himself as a researcher in the field of criminology and criminal justice in India. He has successfully guided 23 PhD scholars, mainly in the field of criminal law and criminal justice. He has contributed 5 sponsored research projects and 3 collaborative projects of Ministry of Law and Justice, Ford Foundation, World Justice Project, UNDP, UGC, ICSSR, etc. In 2001, the Indian Society of Criminology conferred fellowship to Dr. Chakrabarti for his contribution in the field of criminology. In 2017, Professor Chakrabarti has been awarded Professor K. Chokalingam Award by Indian Society of Victimology for his contribution to victimology in India. He was awarded research scholarship by Max Planck Institute of Foreign and International Criminal Law, Friedberg, Germany in 2017 and 2018. Sir, on behalf of NDRG, we welcome you to this particular lecture and also thank you for this collaboration for today's event. I now request Professor Amita to formally start the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. And very warm welcome from NAPSIPAG and from NDRG and from ISS to our very valuable speakers. I would say very valuable speakers because they are launching foundations of a course that is going to really go very strongly into all law schools and also go down deeply into policy making and the structures which are designing policies for disaster management and disaster risk reduction. So a very, very valuable moment for us right now that we are all sitting together. I can see most of our participants that are around are representing various fields, from television, from academics, from policy making, from administration, law universities, and many, many more, the areas which are still very unconventional in a traditional mainstream structure. So I would welcome you all with a very heartening note that we are looking forward to not just organizing and debating and conversing on the issues of disaster law, but meaningfully launching something that would go in a very sustainable manner 2030 onwards and help the developmental processes in this country and in our neighborhood, especially with the number of Bangladeshi scholars joining in today. One can really look forward to a joint program with our neighbors in times to come. After this extremely heartening welcome, I can see Professor Ikramul just switched on his video because we work together for the IFRC little project. So our team is all here. Thank you. Welcome. So why has this been a problem for us in 2014? Because we were still conversing from 2013 onwards, we were still conversing that environmental law should be strengthened so that Kedarnath kind of a disaster that washed off 4,000 people and number of villages over the hilly ranges of Uttarakhand should and could not and will not be repeated. But then we realized that environmental law is just a beginner, and they stop at one point, and beyond that they cannot move the courts, the bureaucracy, and the people who are working at the ground level. And we realized that something like a disaster law, and then suddenly, you know, while we were discussing with a UNDP person who was working with us on local governance, he said we have a disaster law conference going to be held somewhere in Bangkok. I don't remember where, which place he said, but he said the scholars are coming from IFRC, and he moved in Gabriel Emery to us and said, Gabriel will give you the keynote address. And then we started with Gabriel Emery, IFRC connection, and it was unstoppable because we went on, and finally registered a body that would specifically work on disaster management with a special section on disaster law within the NAPSIPAC scholars. And I'm glad to share with the speakers that, and Professor Chakrabarti has been part of us because we've traveled to a number of places together, collecting literature on disaster law. So we found that the NAPSIPAC scholars from law and governance took special interest. And now they are becoming more concerned about the future of mankind into humanitarian crisis, which we are encountering at the moment, climate changes which are coming in, and not very effective governance systems still controlling the reins of decision making in most of the South Asian countries. So I'm happy to concentrate on South Asia and move with a very small note forward, so that Dr. Finau can take it forward. I'm sure she has a number of ideas because IFRC was the one that really provoked us to deal with South Asia altogether. Humanitarian systems, laws during the pandemic, laws to interact with each other during crisis, aid providing, rescue operations, beyond the frontiers relationships. So that's where I would end because I'm looking forward to hearing both of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Amita. I now request and welcome Professor Chakrabarti as the chair for this session and request him to kindly introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you, sir.
Very good morning to all of you, the distinguished participant in the very important for the not only country but the globe, the disasters in humanitarian perspective and the law to be human rights perspectives also. And we are happy that I am privileged to introduce today's the chief guest and speaker, Finau. Finau is the Regional Disaster Law Coordinator for the IFRC Asia Pacific Regional Office and is based in Bangkok. Finau is an international lawyer by trade and a former senior diplomat for the Kingdom of Tonga. She holds qualification in law and diploma from Victoria University, Hong Kong University, Oxford University. She first joined IFRC in 2012 as the Regional Humanitarian Diplomacy and Disaster Law Delegate based on IFRC. Shubha Office and has been fortunate to witness disaster law action via multiple emergency response developments to disaster affected countries to support logistics, coordination, and humanitarian diplomacy efforts. As part of her role in the Asia Pacific region, he now is responsible for leading the disaster law program, a large part of which focuses on legal preparedness for multiple hazards, particularly the areas of climate resilience and public health emergencies. Now, as today is our also birthday of Mahatma Gandhi, and we are thinking of connecting disaster governance management with law, let us look few observations and thoughts of Mahatma Ji on law. The most important one, which I think very much connected with our focus, he wrote, all humanity is one undivided and indivisible family, and each one of us is responsible for the misdeeds of all of others. Now, today's disaster governance, the background is that we fail to preserve our nature, and among the two main reasons for disasters today, one is human beings, other is technology. And for that, Mahatma Ji also wrote, it is to law alone that men owe justice and liberty. It is this salutary organ of the will, all of which establishes in civil rights the natural equality between men. If we to connect today's topic, that how humanitarian approach we could take from disaster governance and law, I think this natural equality between men, the philosophy that propounded by Gandhiji, that is very much embedded in our present trends of looking law on disaster, that it's embedded in human rights conventions and also human rights declarations in our United Nations. Also, United Nations adopted during UN conference in 2005 also, that gathering representatives of international governmental organizations and NGOs, how to answer the private actors and also the international actors in preserving the nature and also the environmental disasters. As I already told, that human intervention and technology both are causes behind today's international concern on our disasters. But regarding law, whatever we may develop, that definitely having its main root in our human rights initiatives. Human rights are, rights inherent in all human beings. All human beings, regardless of nationality, place of residence, sex, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, language, or any other status, are endowed with the dignity which is protected through the idea of human rights. Act proclaimed by UN General Assembly in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted on 10 December 1948, the common standard of achievements of all people and all nations to protect the rights to life, equality, and also the freedom of expression, economic, social, and cultural rights. So given these rights-based or human rights-based approaches, I think can give the disaster governance and law a human face. So whatever laws we have already, and law in the making and law reforms, we have to based on some humanitarian approach. Otherwise, it will denial of basic human rights, and also what not only Mahatma Gandhi but other jurists, legal philosophers said that all are equal, and protection from the state intervention, and for that the governance from the state definitely look into the basic human needs and human rights. And we in the organization, we have already trying to inculcate a sense of human rights based concept of the victims of disasters management. We have a criminology victimology center also. So we are trying to connect these victims as well as the disasters law. Victims not only from the frequent natural disasters, but there are some regions like our Sundarban having some inherent natural calamity and natural surroundings, geographical things, which we have to also take note, so that throughout the year, it is not during the only disasters, the victims' protections and the people's protection in those regions should be part of our thinking and our concept of disasters law. I think our speaker will elaborate it. So let me request now our main speaker today, for which we are waiting to elaborate this aspect. Over to Pinau.
Just a small intervention. I would request all our participants to kindly put their questions in the chat box. If there are any, we will take them at the end of our session. Thank you. Over to you, Finau.
Thank you so much. And esteemed colleagues, Malolele and Namaste, and of course, very warm greetings from Bangkok. It's lovely to see so many of you here. And I have to say, I'm kind of pleased that we didn't finish the round of introductions, because I think it became evident so early on just how accomplished and just how remarkably well qualified so many of you are in your respective fields. And I really think it's a testament to the organisers of this event that we have so many high-level specialists in disaster management and the law attending today. So it really is a pleasure. I really can't tell you what an absolute delight, and also how humbling it is for me to deliver the Mahatma Gandhi public lecture on, excuse me, on peace and harmony on this very auspicious day where we celebrate Mahatma Gandhi's birthday. I still remember so vividly learning about the life and the work of Gandhi as a young brown schoolgirl growing up in a very non-brown South Island of New Zealand. Excuse me. And how much his undaunting moral courage in the face of adversity and oppression due to race, religion, social status, how that really impacted me and left such a lasting impression when, particularly as a young person, it was so easy to get angry and frustrated at the racial injustices of the day. And Gandhi's message of peaceful but meaningful resistance against injustice has really stayed with me across the years. In my line of work, it's really easy to get lost in the day-to-day business and in the workshops, the meetings, the negotiations, the legislation. But on days like today, where we get the privilege of slowing down just for a moment to really reflect on and remember extraordinary people like Mahatma Gandhi, and remember why it is that we got into this line of humanitarian work in the first place. His legacy continues to guide us today because the truths that he espoused are universal, and they continue to be relevant as we strive to come together and unite against the tyranny of disasters and the devastating impact that they have on our communities in our respective countries. So my lecture today will really look at the work of the IFRC and the role that we are playing in our bid, just like Gandhi, to make the world a more peaceful and a more safer place. Next slide, please. There we go. So really, we don't. So I really wanted to just start by kind of just giving a bit of an overview of the Red Cross Red Crescent, just because there are so many different moving parts, and I know that it can get confusing. I'm also going to be using terminology that I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So this is what we call the Red Cross Red Crescent movement. I currently work for the IFRC. We are the secretariat for the 192 member national society. So when I say national society, that's the Red Cross or the Red Crescent organisation that is currently working in your country. And our role really is to support our membership, and we do so in areas, in non-conflict areas such as disaster risk management, broader development work, health, and other related areas. On the top, we've got the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and they work largely in international humanitarian law. So they're working on the laws of war, and this is regarding the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols. So their work is centred on supporting national societies and governments in situations of armed conflict. To the right, we've got our 192 national societies, and this is where all the real work gets done. Our national societies are, they work in an extremely localised way. They're national institutions within their governments, and they have what we call the auxiliary role, where they are recognised as being auxiliary to public authorities with regards to the provision of humanitarian services. So our national societies have a legal base, which is usually a Red Cross law, which articulates what this auxiliary role looks like, and it varies from country to country depending on what the humanitarian priorities are in that country. So for example, in some places it's with regards to being first responders, it's being recognised as being first responders, being recognised as supporting first aid, and sometimes in some cases it's also being recognised as members of disaster management committees at the national level or the subnational level as well. And so this is really the work of our national societies. They have a huge volunteer base which extends well into our local grassroots communities as well, and you'll probably be familiar with the work of the Red Cross or the Red Crescent Society in your particular country. At the bottom, I've got the states parties to the Geneva Conventions, and I've put them here because of the unique auxiliary role that has to be recognised and embedded in some sort of legal framework that recognises the national society. All of these components of the Red Cross Red Crescent movement meet every 4 years in what we call the International Conference of Red Cross and Red Crescent. And every 4 years they meet to discuss, to negotiate, and really to set the humanitarian priorities for the next 4 years. And they make all sorts of resolutions that will then dictate what certain parts of the movement will be doing in the coming 4 years. And this is largely also where we get a lot of our mandate as the disaster law program for the IFRC. Next slide, please. Right, so I thought I'd start really with a snapshot of what we're looking at, and you're probably all well versed on this. But this really is just a look at what the current state of play is in Asia Pacific. So we know that we are disproportionately impacted by natural disasters. Half of all natural disasters occur in this very region that we live in. The Asia Pacific accounts for 60%. That's 60% of all mortalities for natural disasters globally, and 88% of all people who are affected by natural disaster are from this region. So these disasters, as you can see, have resulted in an economic loss of over 1.15 trillion US dollars. Every year, global displacement by natural disasters increases. So that's 26.4 at the last count, 26.4 million at the last count. Women, boys and girls are 14 times more likely to die during a disaster than men. And 70% of countries in Asia Pacific still remain legally underprepared to manage a large-scale disaster. So this is what our research is currently showing at the moment. Next slide, please. So this is a question I kind of get asked all the time, and this question is, so what's law got to do with it? I mean, when most people think about disasters, when you look at images such as these, we see the devastation, we see the destruction, we see the need, and we see what Gandhi always saw is that need for humanity, even in the midst of the most dire of circumstances. And most people think local community responders, you think relief efforts, humanitarian relief items being supplied by national and international organizations. We think containers, appeals, personnel. But how many of us actually think law? It's certainly not the most, not the first thing that most people think of when it comes to disasters, but it's certainly one of the most practical and impactful things that can be done when seeking to reduce and mitigate the impacts of disasters. Next slide, please. So if we look at the current state of play in terms of legal frameworks for disasters and emergencies, we can see that to date, there is still no comprehensive legal regime. So, for example, like in the laws of wars and armed conflict, we've got the Geneva Conventions, which is a comprehensive regime with additional protocols that are added as the laws of war evolve. And unfortunately, there is no such international treaty for non-conflict related emergencies. But despite there not being an international treaty, there are still various sources of law, of international law that are binding, hard law. And there's also non-binding soft law that one can point to provide guidance for both disaster risk management and climate change adaptation, and now also for health emergencies. And we'll have a look at some of these a bit later. So we've got the Red Cross, Red Crescent, or soft law, which is some of these resolutions that come out of the international conference. We've got soft law, which I'll look to in another slide, but really these are, again, non-binding laws. We have the bilateral agreements and arrangements from country to country. There's many where in a disaster, a country may call on a specific neighbouring country for support, and there's already arrangements in place. We've also got the regional laws in our respective regions across Asia Pacific, sectoral laws, which I will also get to in another slide. But just going back to the regional law, so those are things like the ADMIR in Southeast Asia. We've also got what we're looking at for protocols and the development of a regional mechanism in the Pacific. So it's those types of arrangements. We've also, as I've mentioned, international humanitarian law, human rights law. So we've got hard law. And then, of course, we've got global and regional organizations as well, and the various resolutions that come out of those. But again, no one comprehensive set or one-stop shop that governs emergency response or the laws of disaster. Next slide, please. So we can see here that these non-binding commitments that are made, that states make, because they're signalling a moral obligation, if you like, to be bound. And so international cooperation to assist countries affected by natural disasters really is a long-standing practice, and this tradition has been carried on through the international community. The way disaster relief has been carried out and evolved over time, the number of actors that are involved is increasing, and the incidence and the impact of large-scale natural disasters again continues to rise. So we see a change in that. However, the four key principles of humanitarian action remains the same, and that's of state sovereignty, that the primary responsibility for disaster management lies with national authorities, and that international assistance should only be provided with the consent of the impacted state, the primacy of humanitarian principles such as humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. And this is clearly set out in the UN General Assembly Resolution 46812, which really is the, this is such a non-academic term, the mothership of resolutions for global humanitarian architecture. Next slide, please. And this is, again, just that very resolution that sets out the international humanitarian systems, basic norms and principles for international cooperation in disasters. So it recognises those four key humanitarian principles. It also sets up the concept of request and offer by states for assistance, and recognising and really honing down that national sovereignty, that just because a country is impacted doesn't mean that anybody can just fly in and do what they like in terms of supporting, in terms of providing support. Next slide, please. So this slide just outlines some of the sectoral treaties. I hope that's big enough for you to see. And these are, again, these are treaties, these are conventions, these are binding. We've got, so in terms of sectoral, it's because they cover just a certain aspect that impacts on humanitarian assistance during disasters. So, for example, We've got the Tampere Convention, and this is around telecommunications and being able to bring in telecommunications in times of disasters, which traditionally is quite a difficult thing to bring into countries because of the sensitivities of radio frequencies and that kind of communication. So generally, countries have quite strict laws around who can bring this in, how they're able to operate them, etc. During a disaster, and a lot of that is, and a lot of how to comply with that, but still allow international assistance to come in, is covered in the Tampere Convention. We've also got the Chicago Convention, which looks at, which governs international aircraft coming into a country during the time of disasters and how that can be facilitated. We've got the International Health Regulation. So there's a number. There's Convention on Maritime, which looks at, again, at international waters and how maritime vessels coming in during a disaster into national waters, how that can be, again, facilitated and expedited during times of disasters. But again, these are contained in lots of various different legislation frameworks. And even though it's great that we have them, it really is dependent on the implementation at the national level. So you've got these big sweeping frameworks, and it really depends on the country and how they're implemented. And at the moment, it is quite, even though we have these, it is quite low in terms of the implementation into domestic frameworks. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide, please? So this brings us to what is disaster law? And really, it's in disaster law, in the program that I work for with the IFRC, we're looking across the whole entire spectrum of disaster risk management, from preparedness to response, to risk reduction, to recovery. So generally speaking, we specifically look at the Disaster Risk Management Acts or laws in most of the work that we do, as well as more widely across other cross-sectoral related pieces of legislation. And this is particularly for things like risk reduction and also for shelter. Now, nearly 95% of countries in Asia Pacific have some kind of disaster management act, and they have varying levels of comprehensiveness and also implementation. And as you can see here, this is what we seek to do in disaster law, is to ensure that laws are addressing the roles, the responsibilities, and importantly, that they're minimizing the impact of disasters, and they're also reducing risks. And back to that question on what's law got to do with it, it's really important because it sets out the framework at the highest level of government, and it establishes the roles, the responsibilities and functions across government, and sometimes non-government as well as really importantly establishes hopefully budgetary mechanisms as well, and ensures that government and citizens can be held accountable for their actions or their inactions as well. Next slide, please. So throughout our research and our work on disaster law issues, both working at the policy level and with communities, we've really witnessed many disaster law, common disaster law issues across across different countries. And these are the same whether the country is big or small, or wealthy or not so wealthy. It's these same issues that seem to keep popping up again and again. So historically, disaster management frameworks have been very response focused. And over the past 10 years, spurred on first of all by the Hyogo Framework for Action, and subsequently by Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, there's been a real paradigm shift and increase of focus on ensuring better management and limiting the exposure of risk to disasters in the first place. So globally, however, there's still a bit more work to do on the legal issues and also on the institutional framework on recovery. We've seen the issue of the definition of a disaster and what's a disaster, because some definitions are very limited and not flexible enough to cater for new and emerging hazards. And we've really seen this recently with the emergence of COVID, and in many instances, public health emergencies was covered under a very separate framework than the disaster risk management framework, and there was no intersect or interlink between them. And in more cases than not, the public health framework was in some cases 50 or more years old, and so it was really outdated. And so we saw a lot of issues in terms of the definition of what is a disaster and who can respond to that disaster. If we look at international assistance, I'll get to that a bit later, but it's really important to note that the majority of countries don't have strong mechanisms or procedures in place for international assistance. Coordination issues are always present in a disaster. It doesn't matter the sector or the industry, but they are very, very prevalent in cases of emergency. So often it's coordination, not just between international and national actors, but even domestically between central and local levels, and also coordination with other sectors. So law plays a really important role here, and it's really instrumental to help mandate roles and responsibilities, and plays an important role to really legally mandate coordination. Who is at the table is again such a really important point, because disaster risk management is everybody's business. And it can't be everybody's business if everybody isn't invited to be able to set the priorities and to set the actions on how to respond in the first place. So what we now know is that no one sector can do this alone, and it takes a multi-pronged approach. So we need to have government, civil society, Red Crescent, multilaterals, private sector, and also communities themselves that are able to have access to decision making. And law plays a really important role in ensuring that this happens. There are also disaster risk management laws and other sectoral laws that are needed to ensure that they protect rights in disasters and also ensure additional protection for the most vulnerable in disasters. So these are ensuring gender issues, people with disabilities, the elderly, children, migrants in vulnerable situations are all taken into consideration as well during disaster responses. Funding is probably one of the most important jobs of law, to ensure adequate state funding is provided for disaster risk management. So historically, risk reduction has remained the poor cousin of disaster management, with most money really being taken up in response. But it is really good to see countries now starting to put mechanisms in place here to allocate funding for disaster risk reduction. Unfortunately, what we're seeing though is that the filtering of this funding down to community and local level still continues to be a problem globally. Law also plays a really important role to ensure accountability. So accountability to the communities that you are serving, and also accountability for the failure of certain actions that you might take. So citizens should be able to seek remedy through law. And finally, law is only as successful as its implementation. So frontline staff, practitioners need to be able to understand the law, what it says, and to be able to practice it. And communities also need to be aware of what frameworks are in place. But again, this still remains a sticking point in many countries, particularly at the impact at a local level. Next slide, please. Cool. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. Could we go back? Thank you. And so really this is just a quick overview of the genesis of the disaster law program. As I'd mentioned before, we when I was talking about the international conference, so our mandate comes from the international conference, which as a reminder is when the Federation, the IFRC, the ICRC, our national societies and our governments all get together to set the priorities, humanitarian priorities for the next 4 years. And it's through these resolutions that we've been mandated through successive international conference resolutions to provide research and technical support on disaster laws. And we've seen this so far in 3 key areas. It started back in 2003, we've been doing this. And the 3 key areas that have emerged are international disaster response law, and I'll get into that in a bit, disaster risk reduction, and of course, preparedness and response law. So I won't speak to each of these, but it's just, I guess, to give you an overview of where our mandate comes from in this line of work. Next slide, please. So again, as I mentioned, we've been doing this since 2003, and that's almost 20 years now. And we have come up with a series of tools. So I'll speak to it in a bit, and how we come up with these tools, and how we come up with each of the thematic areas. But really, it's our work is in direct response to requests from national societies, from governments for support in looking at the legal barriers that they face when it comes to disaster into emergency response. So, so I mentioned the key areas that we are looking at: disaster risk reduction in the law, IDRL, preparedness and response. We also have public health and emergencies. We've just done, finished some global research, and this was done during the pandemic, on the nexus between disaster risk management framework and public health and emergency frameworks. And we've compiled the learnings from that research into tools that governments can use to strengthen the legal frameworks in this area. We also look to supporting our national societies as well in our work to be stronger advocates for positive legal policy and social change. I haven't included it in here, but we also do a lot of work with our gender and diversity teams to ensure that all of our tools are integrating gender, diversity, inclusion and leadership in decision-making, as well as that they include mechanisms for the protection of women and diverse groups in terms of disasters. And this is an example. Last week, I was in Australia for the Asia Pacific Ministerial Conference on disaster risk reduction, and disaster law was able to give a presentation on a session that was really on sexual and gender-based violence. And the reason we were part of it was because we could share our tools on disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management, and how we can integrate SGBV, gender protection, inclusion into those frameworks. We also have research and tools for housing, land and property rights. We've also got tools as well on planned relocation. So as issues arise and as our governments and national societies and communities struggle, our work almost always increases as we are then given mandate to support this humanitarian need and to look for solutions that can support strong legal frameworks in each of these areas. And I'm really just going to speak to just a few of them, to just the three of them. So first is legal preparedness for international disaster relief. And I'm really conscious of the time, so I'll try and go really quick. So this is really in response to international assistance coming into a country. So what we saw, again, I mentioned it before, more frequent, larger national disasters. What we're also seeing is almost a proliferation of different international responders. So every deployment I've been part of in terms of a response, I have seen at least 10 organizations that I'd never heard of. Humanitarian organizations, they're registered, etc. But what we're seeing is more and more responders on the ground wanting to help and wanting to support. But what we definitely saw was not enough laws, procedures, regulations, frameworks in place to actually manage this influx of international assistance when it comes into a country. And this is whether you are a developed country or whether you are a developing country. We still see these same issues because many people don't factor this into their disaster risk management laws. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide, please? And one more. There we go. Again, as I mentioned, there's a number of legal and regulatory issues that often play out in these major disaster operations, often leading to confusion and often leading to tension. I've been in many situations where there's quite a bit of tension because people are unaware of what they're supposed to be doing or who's supposed to be doing what. And then again, you've got that pressure of there being such devastation outside, and the need for support is so imminent and so dire that it's really, really easy for things to escalate and to get quite chaotic during a disaster. So what we're seeing is some of the barriers that we're seeing are the mechanisms to initiate international assistance. Are there procedures in place? Does Foreign Affairs or the embassies, are they well versed in this in terms of making an offer, receiving an offer? does immigration and customs? Are there procedures in place so that they have a clear understanding of the mechanisms to ensure that they can expedite humanitarian goods in times of disasters, so that you can ensure that the essential relief items are getting to where they need to be? As I'd mentioned before, sometimes there are specialist equipment such as phones, receivers, additional vehicles that have things like, normally have a custom or a tariff on it, that is not waived for some reason during during humanitarian, during a disaster. Also, what kind of professional qualifications are acceptable if you've got doctors or engineers who are coming as part of a response? Are there minimum standards required? Is there some kind of pre-registration for this? Also, really importantly, what happens if an international responder doesn't meet their standards or fails in a duty of care, and what kind of liability procedures are in place? So what we see is not just from the domestic side, but also from the international side, there are oversights as well. We've seen lots of instances where inappropriate goods are sent to countries. For example, I think that there was in Indonesia where pork products were sent as part of humanitarian relief. And so it's these types of things where there are no framework to ensure that these sorts of things don't happen, and that really lead to the bottom line, where aid is slower, more expensive, less efficient, and sometimes counterproductive, particularly if they end up in being unable to be used and end up in landfill. Next slide, please. So we had a really comprehensive look at, in the research, at the issues, and in our bid to find a solution, we came up with 2 tools. So one is the what we call the IDRL guidelines, or the guidelines for international disaster response law. And again, this set out non-binding recommendations, and these recommendations are based on best practices, on norms, as well as existing international instruments on how governments can best prepare their laws. We've also developed a model act as well, again for the facilitation of international assistance into a country. And this is really to provide guidance. Next slide, please. Really, the crux of the guidelines is that domestic actors have the primary role. Anything that comes from international or from outside, it needs to be complementary. There needs to be responsibilities, standards. There's also around facilities for international responders coming in, and also this notion that it's not a right to go into a country and provide humanitarian assistance, that we're guests of the country, and so some of those facilities that enable people going into a country should be conditional based on international providers meeting those humanitarian standards. So I've got, oh, sorry, next slide, please. And so here are just a couple of examples of things happening. So, so for example, from around the region in New Zealand, during the earthquakes, we had dogs that were, so there was a lot of search and rescue dogs that were being brought in, and unfortunately there was no provisions to expedite quarantine for these dogs, and so many of them sat there for such a long time and they couldn't actually get through to provide support or to provide some kind of a shift for the dogs that were currently with the response in New Zealand. So that was a huge oversight by the New Zealand government that they've quickly worked on to rectify. In Vanuatu, again, there was nothing in place to facilitate the huge influx of international assistance coming into the country. And as a result, the government felt very overwhelmed, and they felt they had no control of the response. And in their frustration, they shut down all humanitarian operations, and until people came and reported to the government in order to collaborate with the processes. And then I'll just say one thing: unsolicited goods or donated goods are still so many containers ending up in landfills because they're not required. They're not the specific request of the government, and still we get containers that are filling up ports because there are unwanted goods in a disaster. Next slide, please. So I guess from all of this research on international assistance, what we still see is that the vast majority still lack clear and comprehensive procedures. And sometimes there's a lot of interest right at the beginning, but then that whole, all of those steps to then move from interest to adoption becomes an issue sometimes. And also what we're seeing with legal frameworks is that there's a tendency to refer to an accompanying annex or an accompanying regulation that doesn't exist or has still yet to be developed, and sometimes it just gets forgotten on the shelf until the disaster happens, and then of course it's too late. I'm really concerned about the time, so I will just, if we could just quickly go to the next slide. The next slide. So again, so I won't go into depth on these. I'll really just skim over. In terms of disaster risk reduction, is that, again, we were mandated to look at how we can support governments to strengthen their laws in disaster risk reduction. And so we did, again, the same kind of process for the IDRL guidelines. We did a huge comprehensive global research that culminated in a synthesis report. And then once we had that report, we then condensed it down to a checklist. So next slide, please. And next slide. And so again, this is just the key findings of the global research. And could we go to the next slide, please? Again, so the synthesis report had over 100 pages. So what we did was we condensed it down to 10 questions, just 10 simple questions, checklist type questions that a government can use to assess where their laws are at and what type of support their laws are might be needing. So this is the particular tool that we have in terms of disaster risk reduction. Next slide, please. And so I'll just have a quick look at, so for example, if we look at the top left, this many of you might recognize as Nepal. And so we remember the really fragile construction of the buildings had been long recognised as a key factor or a key risk factor for Nepal, especially with the population of the Kathmandu Valley. And unfortunately, the earthquake happened before there was any work had gone into being able to strengthen that. But what it has done is really provide again with the media attention, a real reminder on the need for disaster risk reduction to be embedded in our laws to make us more resilient to risk. And hopefully it was a lesson for countries on prioritising building codes, particularly for public buildings. On the top right, we've got Vietnam. So they've really seen the benefit of strong laws by taking on board regulations for DRR in terms of saving lives. So and there, the legislation on early warning that talks about the establishment of dikes, of drains, of safe shelters, as well as they've done community awareness activities. And what this has done is led to a real substantial reduction in lives lost from flooding and storms. In the last 10 years, since they've implemented these changes to the legal framework, they've seen a drop of deaths from due to floods from 600 down to 60. And that's quite a significant drop through being able to strengthen your legislation. Next slide, please. Again, response. Again, I'm just going to quickly flick through this. Next slide, please. And again, it's all of the issues that we're seeing with regard to disaster preparedness and response. Again, extensive global research was done, identified what are the key issues that we're seeing that governments, national societies, responders are seeing in terms of response. Next slide, please. And then again, here are some of the key findings, which I will just gloss over. The key findings from that report. And what we did with the key findings was, again, just like with the DRR checklist, we put them into a checklist of 10 questions. And you can skim through the next couple of slides up until the slide with the checklist. Keep going. And keep going. There we go. And so this is an example of what the 10 questions look like. They're quite similar to the same format of the 10 questions in the DRR checklist, very similar to the format for the public health and emergencies research that we've also done with the checklist. And we've done them, so we've shied away from model laws, and we're looking at checklists because every context is different, and it allows each of the governments to be able to incorporate each of the governments and policymakers to be able to incorporate the changes in a way that is relevant to your specific context. Great, and next slide, please. Right, I'm going to stop there. Just some key points to remember in terms of what we're seeing in disaster law is that there is increasing localization. So there's a huge interest in localization, huge interest for us too, in terms of how we can empower and use the law to be able to empower not just government and national actors, but also communities as well in terms of disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management, public health and emergencies. A key point for us is that 70% of countries in our region are still underprepared, and we want to keep bringing that number down, which is why partnerships such as this, such as the IFRC, together with the organisers of this event, these partnerships are crucial because we are not going to hit and lower that 70% on our own. We can't do it on our own. Again, it is really about the work that we're doing to ensure that we are empowering national domestic capability at the national level. And we also want to really promote this, this reactive mode of having all the money in response to a proactive role, I guess, or proactive paradigm shift of being able to support disaster risk reduction and early warning systems and work before a disaster happens. Of course, a lot of our work is making sure that we are understanding the context that we're working in. No one support to government is ever the same because, you know, the contexts are different, the cultures are different, etc. And that is definitely something that we try to take on board in our work in disaster law. I'm extremely sorry for one, going over time, and two, for just quickly rushing through the last few slides. I'm hoping that this will just is the first of many discussions that we can have, hopefully sometime in person as well, where we can look into a lot of this more. But really, thank you for allowing me to share an overview of the work that we're doing to help make the world a safer place. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Do we have any questions before we can request the chair to kindly conclude the session? Are there any questions from our participants? You are on mute, Professor Amita.
Yeah, you know, I think the chair would have a certain, you know, perceptions on reactions to lectures.
So I request chair to kindly give his concluding remarks and his observations.
First of all, I will definitely express my gratitude to Pina, the way she has made us a journey from the last almost 3 decades or 4 decades, how the present disaster law nationally as well as internationally now marching towards more reforms. In the presentation, we have observed that there are almost 4 stages of development, that at the stage when there are only, we have international concern, no national legislations, then how to respond to the disasters, the participations towards protecting the human beings. And third stage is definitely to have national legislations, and the 4th stage is implementation, and where we have to now think, and particularly the today's perception, how the implementation we can have more humanitarian and also the human rights elements in the implementation process. For that, the responsiveness, the disasters risk management and its governance in the last more than 2 decades in the international level, there are a lot of recommendations. The question is that how much we can implement and how much we can adopt in the national legislations. In that respect, if we come to Indian perspective also, that we are more concerned on rights than on implementation machineries or implementation framework. The focus is not only on to have some rights, focus also needed, as madam already in various situations, fact situation pointed out, that we need more preparedness, more people to develop the mechanism to implement legal framework more right-based only. That is not be able to implement like many other legislations. So how we can make it more? For that, I think the NGOs and the institutions like us and also NAPSICAM and others definitely having a role. And I think we need more deliberations how more effectively we can implement and bring some reforms with some framework to have humanitarian aspect in our process of implementation of disaster law. Now open, and thank you, madam, for bringing many fact situations that really think us to change our existing legal framework and the way forward where we should look into that also focus. I think it is now task of the all who are participating and all the NGOs and roles played to be institutions to think how we should reform our laws and also to develop some manpower and some people who think really for the victims, and for that institution like Symbiosis, NUJs in our country and other law schools to come forward, and also other traditional universities also to develop like in other countries, so that concern to the young would be very much necessary so that they will come forward for saving our earth as well as the people. So over to the Monica.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot for your concluding remarks. We also thank Ms. Finau for such an enriching session and such an informative session, as a matter of fact, wherein you dealt with all the aspects of disaster law, and also how institutions and institutions like us, educational institutions like us, like NUJs Kolkata or Symbiosis Law School Pune, where we are trying to develop a separate branch of disaster law, which are the thematic areas which we can always focus on. And it was a very informative session, and also a kind of a learning how to take this forward. I also thank Professor Amita Singh for always taking such initiatives, and what better day can be than Gandhi Jayanti to talk about peace and harmony, and also think about also give again a thought to innovativeness in disaster risk reduction and disaster management practices. I request, not request, I thank Dr. Gaurika Chuk for always spearheading all our events and with so much of commitment. And I thank all our participants for taking out time on their Sunday weekend and joining us for this brilliant session. I thank all our NDRG members for joining in today and always supporting supporting in all our initiatives.
Manika, sorry to interrupt, but there is a question in the chat box.
Is there?
There is one question. I can read the question.
Sure.
This question is by Professor Ikramul. He's asking, how can we expedite the process of incorporation and transformation of international best practices in the domestic legal systems?
Sorry, I missed it because I just checked there was.
No, that's okay. Should I repeat the question once again? Ma'am, you are on mute. You are on mute. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear
Great.
you.
Please, could you repeat the question? I'm trying to find it on the chat.
Sure. Let me just repeat the question. How can we expedite the process of incorporation and transformation of international best practices in the domestic legal systems?
Thank you. What a great question. And really, this is the work of the disaster law program. So all of those checklists and those reports that we've done are really a culmination of our findings. It's a culmination of best practice from the international system. And what our work entails is working with domestic law and policymakers about how to then incorporate that into the domestic system. And really, we work on we don't impose. We will have discussions with governments, with agencies such as yourselves in terms of, so for example, there were some gaps in Samoa, and so they set up a meeting for us to speak with the relevant minister about what those gaps might be. And so it really starts with conversations because we need political will. And once we get political will, because these are legal frameworks, once we get political will, then it is making sure that everybody is part of the discussion. We need all members, all hands on deck who are going to be part of what that looks like, of developing that. So it is quite a process, but if you want to make it a good one, if you want buy-in from every single level as well, you will go through this process. And it also means that the product that you end up with is a great product because everybody's had the opportunity to contribute. It's gone and got the highest sign-off, and it has to go through, of course, all the legal processes. So I mean, like as the Vice Chancellor said, it's a journey, but it's a journey that we can take together. No one can do it alone, and if we bring everybody on the journey with us, we will be more stronger for it coming out the other end.
Thank you for taking up the question, and thank you, Dr. Gaurika, for pointing it out that there is a question. On behalf of NDRG, I thank everybody, especially our keynote speaker and chair, for accepting our invitation and taking out time on Sunday for delivering this keynote session and also chairing the session. And I thank everybody for joining in today.
Before we end, can we ask everyone to please switch on their camera so that we can take a screenshot of all the participants? Everyone, please just switch on your camera for a second.
It was really wonderful. Thanks, Amita ma'am.
Thank you.
Thanks, sir. Thanks, Dr. Fine.
Before we end, just a small announcement to make, for all the participants. On 4th of October, we are having a very important session by Professor Madhav Gadgil on safeguarding fresh water, the key to human survival, on the World Habitat Day. So please, it's a humble request on behalf of NDRG and the Institute of Social Sciences. Please join us on the World Habitat Day on 4th of October, same time from 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
everybody.
Amita. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.